Andreas looked back over his shoulder. He was the passenger on the horse Brandon guided, simply for the fact that he weighed less than the shorter, yet stouter ranger. The only thing he could see along their back trail, though, was the big plume of smoke. The trees that had been set afire in the battle with the Cody militia were still burning. Brandon felt the movement as he kept their rangy bay at an easy trot. "Don't even look back, Tarin. It's almost impossible for anyone to come up from there." He indicated the slope to the east and the little 2 tracks crisscrossing the mountaintop from that direction. "If anything, they'll come up from that direction." He guided the gelding higher, closer to the rim rocks at the western edge of the mountain. The view was dizzying. The ancient crags of Yellowstone stood blue and gray in the distance, while the canyon just below lay before them with green spring pastures edged by sharp cliffs, even a few irrigated fields down by the cottonwood-lined trees. A gravel road cut through it, almost straight and in good repair. An easy path for any group of men on bikes. While up on the mountaintop, they still had to skirt the occasional snowdrift. The canyon's bottom was clear of all snow. To the east lay the town of Cody, and beyond it the valley was filled with orderly fields, almost emerald in their early spring color. Andreas scooted back and let himself drop to the ground and ran beside the riders. They were only at a slow trot since their horses had already carried them close to 30 miles. As several of their companions did the same, leaving only the injured and the women still astride, Brandon nodded his approval. "Take a hold of that back cinch. He can pull you along." Andreas nodded, then looked around for beats. He was running close, not nosing about, nor investigating their trail ahead. Even the inexhaustible Aussie was feeling the effects of the long day, and it was not even noon yet. "You think they're going to send their fighters after us?" Brandon nodded wryly, turning his dark eyes on the town. "Oh, yeah, no doubt about that. I know that Parker Northwood. He won't let it go. After all, they know where we're going." He turned his dark eyes on the town, hitching the bow across his back into a better position. "With a little bit of luck, I think we can hide in the very highest crags." Andreas looked at their mounts. They still had a bit of go left in them, but not the kind of trip Brandon was proposing. Brandon had followed his gaze and chuckled. "There's a pasture with good horses just about 5 miles ahead. We'll swap out there." He urged his gelding to a bit more speed, adding, "We just got to get there before they do." They traveled on, and at a trot just fast enough that the running men could sustain. Yet they'd only gone about an hour when the burnt-out fire Tarin called for them to stop. Summer had guided her horse in front of Zach's, calling, "Rick, come here! You need to stop the bleeding again!" She took the other horse's bridle and led him forward. Even though a silk scarf covered her eyes, she found Rick easily. Andreas had never stoned himself, and he wondered if he could use his senses as easily as she did. He closed his eyes and tried to concentrate on only the minerals that made up every living being, but could sense very little that distinguished them from the surrounding vegetation. Earth, rocks, pebbles, and granite, the heart of the mountain pulled at his perception, far outshining the minute traces of minerals in the living things. Someone cuffed his shoulder. "Hey, dumbass, what are you doing? Sunning yourself?" As he jerked his eyes open, Colby smiled at him. "Good morning, sleeping beauty. Get aboard this nag. We're supposed to follow Grandpa." Andreas mounted the yeller and winced. The stirrups were a few notches too long. He'd be miserable if they had to do any real riding. But as they followed Brandon, he indicated Rick tending to Ryan's injuries. "Did the first healing not hold up?" Colby shrugged. "It might have if we could have just let him rest. All this riding, though." As Andreas looked their companions over, he noticed the fire Tarin, Emmett. The big Indian was sitting very straight in the saddle, moving as little as he could. He told them he'd gotten tumbled by one of their rock Tarins while they were fighting against the Cody men. Both the water Tarins and the spirit Tarin, all from the Yellowstone bunch, had confirmed that his back was badly bruised and several of his ribs might be broken. Andreas wryly shook his head. Brandon's idea of a mad dash for home, across all those high peaks, nonetheless, might turn out to be easier said than done. They followed Brandon down a game trail, heading down into the western canyon. It was steep and narrow, but the horses handled it easily. Eventually, they came to a spot that had been haphazardly fenced. Several rails crisscrossed each other, anchored only by a lonely cedar further up the draw's side and a boulder on the other. The block was old enough that sagebrush had taken hold around it, further strengthening it. The game trail went straight through the rails. The deer, elk, and sheep had simply jumped over them. As they stopped, the meadow came into view, thick green grass covering the easy slope beyond. Colby twisted in the saddle and grinned at Andreas. "Looks like the Canyon and Rimrock Fencing Company operates in Wyoming just like it does back home." Andreas laughed at the old quote. Colby's father used to say that when the steep cliffs were enough to stop the cattle from leaving their pastures. A block like this, across the occasional draw, was all that was needed. Brandon turned his horse at the obstruction. "Sure wish we had some magical voodoo-type way to clear this so we can get through." But when Andreas rode forward, Brandon held up a hand. "Not you." With a shrug, he added, "You'll tear up the ground too much for our horses." Andreas backed away with a shrug. Yes, he could clear the rails, but also, yes, in the process, he'd tear up the ground in gouges that would be hard on their ponies. Pixie and Floyd stepped forward, raising their hands. Tarins sang in the air, and while Andreas had expected a strong gale, the wind didn't move. An unseen force, silent and invisible, tore the old rails off their anchors. The only sound was that of the aged wood cracking, then tumbling hollowly along the trail. As they filed through, one of their mounts let out a long, high-pitched whinny. After a moment, an answer sounded from further down the meadow, and the herd of horses came loping up over a ledge not long after. They rushed toward the riders, their heads high and their tails waving behind them as they ran. Andreas counted as they came. 22. He breathed a sigh of relief. There would be enough, a fresh horse for everyone. At the same time, he wondered why the bunch was so agitated. With all the good forage at their feet and the warm morning sun, they should have been mostly concerned with filling their bellies or soaking up the warmth. While they coaxed the horses closer, building a ring of riders around them, he couldn't shake a feeling of foreboding. He waved at Colby. "Hold my spot. I'm going to check something out." Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the other Tarins fidgeting in their saddles, looking all around. They had felt it as well. As he rode up the meadow, Brandon called to him. "I don't know what you're hunting, boy, but it can wait until you got a fresh stick under you." Andreas returned a whatever gesture and, with Beats at his side, continued to follow the resonance he'd felt. He dropped down a low swale, and there, in the bottom of it, several wolves came loping up from the tree-lined creek at the bottom of the canyon. With a low curse, he realized how much bigger the wolves had gotten since he'd last seen one. Their shaggy gray coats flashed with sleek health, glossy and vibrant, and their yellow eyes seemed to shine in the late morning sun. Their shoulders and thickly maned necks were much bigger now than they should be, making them seem even more ferocious. They'd seen him. They were coming for him. As his Tarin rose inside him, he gave a soft laugh. The exhilaration of the mother's gift filled him, and he raised his hands, guiding his horse beneath him with his legs only. Of course, the unfamiliar mount balked at the thought of running towards 6 very large wolves, and Andreas allowed the yeller to stop. It wouldn't matter. This was the true enemy, and he could wait for them to come to him. He grinned ruthlessly as he waited for long moments, allowing the pack to come closer, to encircle him, and to begin biting Yeller's hind feet. The gelding tried to run, but Andreas harshly reined him around, making him dance in that spot. As the wolves tried to lunge closer, trying to bite at Yeller's legs, he buried the first one, then the next. He only dropped about a foot of clay out, immediately reforming it with hardened rock. It was the first trick he'd learned, and to this day it remained his favorite. Before, when the animals had truly been wild, not connected to San Pet, the predators would have been deterred to see their leaders suddenly struggle, whining and biting at their legs encased in clay. Not anymore, though. These overgrown distortions were controlled by something, someone else. They only saw a lone Tarin, one they wanted to kill at all costs. Beats had gotten embroiled in a fight with two of the others, and he was quickly losing ground against the bigger, more ferocious hunters. With a wave of his hand, Andreas dropped all three down into the dirt, rendering them immobile to their bellies. While the good Aussie was still in danger of being bitten, he would have to fend for himself for a few moments, as the last two wolves still harried Yeller. Andreas found a sizable, heavy rock hidden in the grass. With a wave of his hand, he dislodged it to fling it into the spine of the first one. The animal dropped with a desperate whine and then stilled. Bringing the same heavy stone up high and around his shark, he sped it up and nailed the last one right on its head. With a sickening sound of cracking bones, the oversized predator was brought down. With 4 wolves, and his dog, caught in the dirt, Andreas dropped the big rock. It was too cumbersome. He called a smaller pebble to him, lashed it all around him, and nailed one of the wolves beside Beats. It struck the huge canine like a bullet. He nodded to himself, satisfied with the results. He didn't necessarily need the help of a wind Tarin to add velocity to the smaller objects. He dispatched the others in the same way, already noticing that Beats had taken several wounds across his face and neck. The little Aussie would not last much longer. Andreas released him and, leaning from the saddle, called him closer for a few pets and good dogs. Turning to the last two still buried in the clay, he took his knife from the back of his belt. He flung it at one, recalled the knife, and sent it against the other one. He was no expert knife thrower, and he had to use his Tarin to guide the blade. One by one, they whined their defeat as their life left them. When they lay still, he could not help but marvel at their ferocious beauty. Even though they were almost twice as large as they should have been, they had retained all the fleetness and agility of their normal state. Colby's voice called out from just above. "Yeah, baby, that was awesome!" His bow was in his hand. An arrow knocked, and he came closer, guiding his horse by his legs alone. "The others said you had something cornered down here. I only saw the last little bit when I came, but it looked badass enough." Andreas turned his head and smiled at the praise. Then he noticed the fresh mount under his friend. "Looks like you upgraded." Colby put the arrow back in his quiver. "Yeah, bro. Brandon wasn't lying when he said these horses would be good ones." Picking up the reins of his dark bay, he stopped easily, then guided his horse around in a tight spin, first one way, then the other. Andreas grinned widely. "If mine is even half that mobile, I might give him a big kiss, right on his tail." Then he halted and asked, "You did catch one for me?" Colby laughed. "Hell yeah. We got the real work done while you were over here playing with your voodoo." He guided his horse up the pasture, using only the smallest, lightest cues. "Come on, we got horses for everyone. We're just waiting for you." But Andreas waved him to follow. "In a minute. A couple of these wolves had a lot of blood on them before they even got to me and Beats. I want to find out why." Colby gave an impatient huff. "Remember, there's a whole slew of those Cody guys wanting a piece of us. You really want to play Sherlock Holmes over a little bit of blood now?" Andreas didn't acknowledge his cousin's objections. He just turned Yeller, tired as the horse was, down towards the bottom of the pasture. Seeing Ditto fell in with Beats, Andreas knew that Colby followed. The dogs nosed ahead, following the trail of the huge hunters through the field. They dropped down another low swale, and the creek meandering through the newly leafed trees came into view. A small log house sat in the center of a tidy yard on the other side of the dirt road. While no one seemed to be around, it looked as though it was in use. There were horse droppings beside the rail fences, and foot traffic had worn paths through the vegetation. But that wasn't what stopped Andreas and Colby dead in their tracks. On this side of the pasture fence, more than 50 cows lay sprawled, and not in the good chewing their cud while they rested way. Legs stuck out at odd angles, and heads were bent in awkward positions. The black-coated mamas lay lifeless in the green grass. Little bitty calves, not much more than a month old, lay amongst them, the black coats making stark contrast against the verdant green of the meadow. Each throat had been torn open by a terrifying dagger-long fangs, wet and sticky blood caking the black coats. Colby let out a long string of very vile curses. Andreas could only hang his head at the useless destruction before him. All those beautiful mamas and their babies. They'd been killed only for the fun of the chase. Beats and Ditto were more practical. They stopped their nosing about to investigate one of the calves. Soon, they began licking at the blood leaking from the slashed neck. Andreas dismounted with a sigh and took the little knife from the back of his belt. With a few sure strokes, he cut through the black coat, then began whittling little pieces of meat. He tossed them to the dogs. Normally, it would have been comical to see them slurp the fresh slices down, but his grief at the annihilation was too sharp. Methodically, he fed the dogs, then cut off a bit more to put in the saddlebags for later. Meanwhile, Colby went to one of the cows and, without much finesse, used his own knife to slice a big chunk from the cow's hind. Wrapping it in a piece of the t-shirt fabric they all carried now, he said, "Supper." And with a look at the sun, he added, "Hopefully it'll stay cool enough so it don't spoil on us." As they trotted back up the pasture, Beats and Ditto loping beside them, they scanned the meadows all around, as well as the dirt road that led down to the former highway. They could see more cattle in a different field, but no people. Where the inhabitants of the cabin were was anyone's guess. Passing the spot where Andreas had buried the wolves, they saw a striped badger and her little kits already at work getting to the easiest parts of the carcasses. The adult came towards them, hissing and growling as they passed by. With a laugh, they gave her a wide berth and continued up towards the others. But when they got to where the horses had been caught, all they found were a few tired ones, rolling after being unsaddled. Their companions had already started up the same draw they'd come down. Andreas and Colby caught up, and, as it happened, they ended up right behind the air Tarin Pixie. The tall girl led 3 horses, head and tail together in the packer way. Just past the entrance to the draw, she stopped and waved Colby to go on ahead. Turning to Andreas, she said, "You should probably leave that nag here. He looks like he could use a rest." With a wave of her hand, she indicated the wildflower-dotted pasture below. Andreas stripped the yeller, turned him loose, and watched the horse gladly drop his head to crop at the good grass. As he went about settling the leggy, deep-chested thoroughbred that was last in her string, he said, "Pixie, if it ain't too much to ask." He adjusted the breast collar on both sides, while the dark bay waited more or less patiently. "How in the hell did you guys get caught in those tunnels?" She took a deep breath, sighing it out with half a moan, and Andreas instantly felt bad about his probing. But she squared herself and gave a helpless shrug. "We had 10 Tarins with us, all of the highest power, but our range ain't far enough to beat an arrow. I don't have a fire sight like Summer and Emmett, but not even they alerted us to anything being wrong. We came out of that first tunnel, the longest one, not suspecting anything. And as soon as we got out on the blacktop, where we were hemmed in by the cliffs and the river, arrows, like 1,000,000 of them, rained down on us." She hung her head, but kept the horses on the lead lines close. "Hayden, here's my boyfriend from back home, was one of the first ones killed. In only about 2 breaths, he had 6 arrows in him and slumped down over his bike." She held her breath, and Andreas could tell she was trying to tough it out. "Of course, I threw up a wind block right away, but it was too late for Aiden. His eyes were open still and staring at nothing, and he just dropped off his back." She turned away, and he could see that she surreptitiously wiped her eyes. "Our other wind Tarin was killed in those first few moments, as was the other spirit Tarin, Brooke. Almost all the Normas we had with us, and all our dogs. And we could do nothing." She gritted her teeth and ground out, "Running for that other tunnel was the best we could come up with. Our power just doesn't range as far as those arrows." He put the bridle on the bay and tied the halter above the saddlebags. "We got 'em back for you, Pixie. Revenge for Aiden and everyone else who died." The shrug she made as she rebundled her longish brown hair and put the tail right through the back of her baseball cap said it didn't really matter. Revenge would not bring her boyfriend back. She led her horses uphill, and he dealt with his newest mount. Taller than most horses in the area, the gelding's chest felt huge under him. There was the initial tenseness that could have led to some crow-hopping, but the bay got over it in short order. When they came back to the meadow at the top of the mountain, the 3 injured had been helped by the water and spirit Tarins. That didn't mean they were well, only that their swelling was down and their pain had been diverted. While they now had enough horses, they still only had 7 saddles. Emmett with his broken ribs and Ryan with the arrow holes in his thigh and shoulder were both allotted mounts with tack. Woody, Emmett's normie buddy, proudly grabbed the halter of one of the slick-backed horses. He gave a huge smile, his teeth white as snow against his darker skin. Me and Emmett used to ride in the Indian bareback races at the rodeo and such. He twisted his belt buckle up, showing off the champion inscription. For the most part, we did pretty good. With that, he looped the halter rope over the gelding's neck, grabbed a hold of a piece of black mane, and vaulted aboard. The horse, never having been treated in such a way, spooked sideways, then jumped several times. With only a halter on his head, there wasn't much Woody could do to stop him, but he managed to guide the jumps and soon had his new mount loping in a large circle all around them. Andreas and Colby, as well as a few of the others, cheered him on. That had been a pretty bit of riding. Brandon urged them to hurry as they matched horses and saddles with riders. Suddenly, while they were getting going, Kristen spoke up. Guys, stop! Her eyes were lit up purple and the scars around them were raised and pulsing. In the lead, Brandon impatiently cursed, but he whirled his fresh mount around. What? Kristen, still only a basic rider, clumsily guided her own horse closer to him. I let JT know we're okay and traveling home with you, but he wants to know your plans and he wants to know where the fire focus is. Brandon took off his cowboy hat and wiped the sweat off his brow. Didn't you see him and his brother run down the mountain to help Chiari and Brady? When she shook her head, he added, those 4 should be down at the bottom of this mountain, heading north. They are supposed to meet up with us in a pasture a few miles west of Hart Mountain. While she assumed that faraway look again, he replaced the hat and screwed it down tight. Kristen, don't tell him we're going there. I'm taking you guys home by the fastest route possible. I don't want to tangle with those archers again. We were fool lucky to come out of this morning's fight as good as we did. Hearing that, Andreas stepped his own horse forward. What? No, we can't leave those guys waiting for us over there. What if they get in trouble with more Cody men? Brandon scoffed and turned his horse north. They'll figure it out. Twisting in the saddle, he ticked names off his fingers. Chiari, Brady, Rolan, and Chris, plus that monster dog of his. The feral grin on his face was all teeth against his reddish beard. I'd say they got this. Chris looked at the mule team with worry. They had pulled the wagon carrying Spencer and Redford for the last 5 days. The 2 long-eared sorrels were gaunt, and their ears tiredly flopped back and forth with their steps. But the sedan wagon was light and pulled easily, and beside the 2 injured Tarins, it only held Jade and Ariel. The 2 spirit Tarins had assured him again and again that the 5 mules were fine, that the harness fit perfectly now, and that they could keep going. And Chris knew he should believe them. After all, reading the mood in the room was the purple-eyed lady's job. Thankfully, they were now only about 3 miles away from the Madison Camp. Soon, the tough equines would be able to catch a break, to eat their fill, and to get rested up. The road followed the course of the river for miles, and since the canyon village, one side of the highway had been cleared of the last lingering snowdrifts. Earlier, they'd seen plenty of buffalo, deer, elk, and antelope along the river, grazing peacefully amongst the fresh grasses along its banks. Now, there were very few, and they immediately fled when they heard the horses draw near. The day was absolutely gorgeous, with the bird song competing with the steady shushing of the river below them. Spencer and Redford were propped in the load platform, pillows, coats, and blankets stacked all around them, cushioning injured limbs. Shelby and Cody rode their horses close by, talking animatedly with the other riders in their group. Over the last few days, their stories had trickled out of them. Chris no longer wrestled with the impact of the destruction he'd worked, the men he'd injured or killed. What had been done to those 5 people was He let his horse drop back until Jessalyn rode up by his side. He reached out and touched her hand, and she folded her fingers into his with a glad smile. His Jessalyn. The Cody folk had treated her better than the others. They had needed her abilities, her way of reading the water flows, of directing it across the huge fields they now needed so badly. Her abilities had shielded her from the barbaric treatment the others had been subjected to. While Shelby seemed to be raw about it and kept her distance, the others, Cody, Redford, and Spencer, didn't carry the same grudge. Not even Ariel, who had been in the same cell with Jessalyn. Leaning from the saddle, he enfolded her in a hug. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. She was with him now, and together they were approaching the waterfall where she, as well as the others, would be confirmed as Tarins of the Yellowstone Circle. Bud's wagon, loaded high with his belongings and their bedrolls and such, followed closely behind the first. Damien, the fire Taran who'd burnt himself out while battling his drug withdrawal, sat astride a gentle mare just behind, while Rolan and Ada rode beside Bud, trading bad jokes and highly embellished stories. Chris looked over Jessalyn's shoulder. Sitting up in the saddle, he indicated Finn, the oldest of the four boys. You know, those four kids really learned a lot in the last few days. They are all riding better. The horses were beautiful in the early evening light. Hundreds of hooves rang against the blacktop pavement as the herd walked alongside the wagons. Golden sun glistened off the bay, sorrel, black, white, and palomino hides. There were even a few roans and paints, and a couple of Appaloosis. Jessalyn smiled as she watched the four boys manage them. They've sure been helpful. They'll do anything for you, but... She looked at Chris from under the brim of her baseball cap and swiped a strand of black hair behind her ear. If Bud needs something, they've got it done before he's even asked. Chris looked at the man holding the lines of their second wagon. I wish I knew how he does it, but that old man gets everyone dancing to his tune. Even you. Jessalyn laughed. How could I help it? He's so charming. And he's an elder. She squeezed his hand. But you know, you are the one that holds my heart. She leaned from her horse and, with a crooked finger, gestured him closer. When he responded with a smile, she kissed him deeply as their horses walked along. You ain't got nothing to worry about. When Kiari called, yeah, get a room, people, Chris chuckled softly and let Jessalyn go. Suddenly, Killer ran forward and barked loudly. He joined in with deeper, harsher barks, the hackles on his black and white coat rising. A boy on a pony raced down one of the bluffs above the road. He waved at them and whirled his little mount about. Then, flailing his boots against the pony's sides, he raced away towards the camp. Not long after, a whole group of people met them, riding on horseback or bikes. The natives began a chant, rhythmic even without the drums. Brady and Damien rode forward, lifting their weapons high, and answered the chant with their own ululations. Jade lifted her voice, smiling broadly as she stood up in the wagon. Several horse girls came for their loose horses, telling Connor, Matthew, Rory, and Finn they would take them to a new pasture. The fire and water Tarins had cleared it of the weed, and it was now safe grazing. The horse herd, their glossy coats shining in the early evening light, trotted with the girls, as if they recognized them and knew that rest and grass were just ahead. When they descended to the riverbank and then splashed across, Rusty and Killer wanted to go with them, but Chris called them back with a sharp command. As the people from the camp neared the mule wagon, however, the mood abruptly changed. The two Tarins in the back brought gasps and outraged exclamations. The black eyes, the swollen noses and lips, the splintered legs, and worst of all, the arms that ended in bloody bandages at the wrists. Angry mutterings, along with shocked gasps, filled the air as people swarmed closer to get a look. The press of them stopped the mules, who stood quietly, their tired ears sagging. Chris turned to Jessalyn. You stay here. Then he quickly trotted his horse to the front. He cursed under his breath when he noticed her tailing him and positioned his horse so that he sheltered her. Somewhat. Twisting this way and that in the saddle, he yelled at the crowd, People! People! Make room and let us through! Rolan and Ada were suddenly on either side of him, and Rusty and Killer began pacing all around the wagon, scaring people back. When people stopped pressing them, he added, "We have to bring these men to the mother." He turned to indicate Ariel, clinging to Jade's arm. "And the spirit Tarin." "She's breached. You're terrifying her. Right now, our sage is the only one keeping Ariel inside her own mind. Give us all some space and let us through." Shelby and Cody, both still sporting bruises and cuts resulting from the treatment they'd received at the Cody jail, rode beside their Tarins, urging people to calm down, to stay back. Reluctantly, the crowd gave way, and both wagons resumed their plodding progress. Beautiful pines, healthy and strong, lined the highway as the procession continued towards the camp, and the people, Tarins and normies, native or not, contained their anger. From his position beside the wagon, he looked back at Damien. As the mother's gift pulsed all around them, the burnt-out Tarin huddled on his horse, a grimace on his face as he clutched the blindfold covering his eyes. He could feel Jade's purple power as she struggled to calm all four of her charges. He rode to Damien's side and put his hand on the skinny kid's shoulder. Maybe his focus power would help. The small, black-haired Tarin maneuvered closer on his bike. As he came near, his eyes began to shine with Spirit's violet light, and he added his strength to Jade's. Damien breathed a sigh of relief and sat up a bit straighter, and the sickly gray-green aura around him calmed. A little bit. With a smile, Chris quietly told the guy thanks and received a "don't worry about it" gesture in turn. His gaze caught on Karsten. Once one of Brent Eagle's followers, he had done well over the last week. Now, though, he was once again surrounded by his old friends from the camp. The others who'd been part of that no-good bunch. "You guys keep it in your cores. Damien can't take all that fire Tarin buzzing around him." Karsten nodded his acknowledgement, then passed the request on. All around, the others toned their power down, realizing, belatedly, that they had been adding to the stress, not only for Damien, but also for Ariel. The crowd swirled and flowed all around them, as people tried to press close. Most greeted friends, but some simply wanted to hear what had happened. How had a rock Tarin and an air Tarin managed to be caught? How had they been able to be subjected to such torture? As they were peppered with questions, Chris's unease grew. Jade had kept JT updated on things. He'd known all along, yet it seemed as though he'd not told anyone else. While only Wynn's white bird circled above them now, earlier they'd also seen JT's purple eagle. The spirit focus had kept track of their progress, and he knew the travelers were approaching. He could have sent a couple of his Tarins to help with Ariel and Damien. Instead, Jane had almost breached herself, trying to keep both of her charges sane. When they came around another bend, the four other focuses came from the other way. Riding sleek, beautiful horses, they were dressed in the ceremonial garb that would allow them to take the four new Tarins to the waterfall. In true native fashion, bead, feather, or bone embellishments decorated their chests, arms, necks, and even hung from their hair. Chris lifted his battered cowboy hat from his head, scratched the scars across his brow, and turned to Jesselyn. "Ooh, boy, I don't think I'm dressed for this." But his attempt to make light of things was met with nothing but a vacant stare. Up till now, her attention had been directed to where she would eventually find the waterfall. Now, however, her eyes unerringly locked on Vanna, the water focus. As her horse walked on, she breathed a sigh of relief, closing her eyes and lifting her face to the western sun. "I am so glad. This place has been calling me for months, and now I'm finally here." Killer sprang forward and challenged the newcomers, completely oblivious to the humans' reaction at their appearance. With a sharp call, Chris tried to bring him back, but the skinny pit bull didn't let up his show of vigilance until Rusty snapped at him. When the four focuses met the procession, JT completely ignored Chris and went to Ariel's side. She was still arm in arm with Jade on the driving platform of the wagon, and the spirit focus began to confer with both women in low tones. Vanna, on the other hand, guided her horse to the wagon. She was dressed in sleek yoga-style clothes, ready to present her new Tarins to the mother. She'd woven a few colorful bead strings into her deep black hair, and her otter clung to a pad she'd fashioned behind her saddle, sometimes climbing to her shoulder to peek beyond her face. As she rode past, she greeted Jessalyn warmly, if briefly. When she saw her water Tarin propped up amongst pillows, blankets, and coats, her face became grim. Her gaze took in Redford's injuries, then drifted to Shelby and Cody. Finally, deigning to notice Chris, she asked, "How could you let this happen?" Chris gaped. "Me?" Reining his horse closer and struggling to keep his volume down, he leaned from the saddle to hiss, "You're gonna blame this mess on me?" Rusty was suddenly beside him, and he motioned at the dog to wait. "I left as soon as I found out about Jess being caught up in that jail. As soon as I could." He waved at the maimed Tarins, at Ariel, Shelby, and Cody's beaten and bruised faces. "And we were too late. By days. Several days." JT abruptly left his conversation and butted his horse between theirs. "We will not have this conversation here and now." Vanna shrank back and wrapped her jacket closer around herself. JT straightened and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "We'll bring our new Tarins to the mother. Anna, you have two of them, Jessalyn and Spencer. Wind has Redford. My Ariel is breached, and Chris has Damien, who's burnt out." He fixed a stern eye on Vanna. "That is our only objective today. The rest can wait until tomorrow." He twisted in the saddle to look at Chris, and his expression brooked no objection. The big earth focus brought his horse closer, and with his huge buffalo bull lumbering by his side, positioned himself beside JT. Chris settled himself in the saddle. "No need to shine your purple eyes at me, JT. I think that's a great idea." Looking at Rusty, he had to suppress a smile. The dog's shoulders now reached well above his stirrups, yet, like any border collie, he smiled and licked his lips at the prospect of chasing the bull. "Easy," Chris murmured, then added, "No." Rusty's posture became less eager, less threatening, and he lifted his visage to Chris, laying his ears back as he grinned. The procession continued, and when they passed by the camp, invisible behind the thick pines lining the highway, more people came out to join them. The mules calmly plodded on, pulling the sedan wagon over the smooth blacktop road. The evening grew dark as heavy clouds raced across the sky and obscured the setting sun. Rolan trotted his horse up, pulling his collar up against the dropping temperatures. "I've been talking to folks. Apparently, Brandon and the others haven't made it home yet." Chris let out a low curse. "They should have beaten us by days. We practically had to crawl on account of Spencer and Redford." The two Tarins had not been able to endure any pace faster than a walk. Roland surreptitiously indicated the crowd all around. "Don't you think someone should go looking for 'em?" Chris rolled his eyes and pointed to the southeast, to the uncountable high peaks and crags that stood between them and Cody. "And on which mountain would you think you could find them? Which pass do you think they went over? Which creek bottom would be a good guess?" With a glance at the sky, he added, "JT's bird ain't up there. Only Wind's White Eagle. I bet he's off somewhere, keeping an eye on Brandon's guys. Besides, they got a spirit Tarin with them. JT knows where they are. He's just not saying." When they reached the parking lot above the waterfall area, they tied their horses to the trees and loosened the cinches. With some discussion, Wind called on her Tarins, and they just about pushed Brady out of the way in their eagerness to help. With Tarin vibrating all around them, Redford audibly groaned. The power he could no longer wield filled him, and a small sob escaped his chest. Settling back and letting them do their thing, Brady stood beside Chris. "I've been lifting these two guys in and out of that wagon every morning and night, by myself. But apparently, now it takes 2 sets of airflows to each man." Chris chuckled as he made sure Sour Patch's bridle was tied to one of the saddle strings. But before he could say anything, Jessalyn grinned at Brady. Come on now. Don't be jealous. You got to do it over the last few days. They might as well get a turn." Chris indicated Damien. "You can help me with him. His firesight won't help him at all climbing over cold rocks and brush." With the burnt-out kid in tow, they climbed down to the steep bank. When they reached the edge of the deep pool under the falls, they found all the fires in the little braziers were lit. Chris cast a look at JT as the slender man conferred with Jade. The spirit focus had sent someone down here to light them. He'd known Chris and his companions were getting closer. He could have sent someone to help Jade days ago, not just when the optics were in his favor. Spencer and Redford sat on the air cushions, seeming to float just above the boulders and rocks. Redford fought the tears that poured from his eyes without success as Tarins swirled all around him. Tarin that was no longer his. Tarin he could no longer wield. Cody stood beside him. He gripped the long knife at his belt, his knuckles white, but there was little he could do to help his brother's pain. He could only keep watch. Chris hissed at Rusty, then indicated Cody. The big dog lowered his ears in response, then trotted to Cody's side. Bumping up against the cowboy's hip, he placed himself to beg for a pat. The Montana kid absent-mindedly dropped a hand to the narrowhead and tousled the dog's ears. It had been decided that Ariel needed to go first. She clung to Jade, terrified at the unforgiving bank with its sharp rocks and the fast currents ahead. Jade boldly stepped into the water with her, guiding her as JT found the string that would lead them under the roaring falls. Another spirit Tarin rushed in, gaining contact with the breached girl. Her terrified cries quieted somewhat until the three had tugged her under the plummeting water. Jessalyn fidgeted beside him, and Chris looked around for Vanna, but the water focus was occupied, talking to Spencer, calming him as he waited aboard his air chair. Putting a comforting arm about her, he leaned down to kiss her cheek. "You'll probably have to wait till last. Everyone else needs it more than you." Her deep sigh changed into a groan. "Now that I'm so close, I can't think of nothing else." He let his Tarin rise inside his core as he held her. Maybe his focus power could help while she waited. She eased marginally in his arms. Beside them, though, Damien breathed a sigh of relief. He should have used his talent to shield the gaunt kid much earlier. He was ashamed that he hadn't realized that. There were so many things they had to figure out. So many things to learn by doing. Eventually, Ariel emerged from the waterfall, and the Tarins of the crowd cheered approvingly. Her aura no longer held that sickly tinge, only the clean purple of spirit. JT swam back, while the other spirit Tarin guided her up the steep mountainside. To complete the ritual, she would now commune with the tree. JT prepared Spencer, the maimed water Tarin, next. A small argument broke out when Shelby insisted that she would accompany him, until Ada came forward and took the slender young woman by the arm. In urgent, low tones, she assured the girl, then took her up onto the riverbank. Vanna, the sleek water focus, slid into the pool along with one of the others. Jessalyn then grinned with delight as the two split the current around them. The wind Tarins who held Spencer's carrying cushion stepped into the channel that now swirled around Vanna and the other water Tarin. But Spencer began to struggle, protesting loudly. "Let me go! Let me down!" The wind Tarin stopped, and Spencer struggled from his soft bench. Only his right leg was broken, and he now used the left. With his forearms and elbows, he pushed himself into the water, then smiled tremulously. He hugged his maimed arms to himself, shielding the bandaged ends. Vanna shrugged, and with a few words, she directed the wind Tarins to meet them under the falls. Someone would have to lift the Tarin up the ledge on the other side of the sheeting water. Jessalyn laughed again as the water focus created an eddy that carried Spencer against the fast current. When he disappeared under the falls, she exclaimed, "Oh my God, she's amazing!" It seemed to take forever, but finally Spencer emerged again. A water Tarin helped him get out of the pool. A huge shout went up from the crowd when Spencer rose to his feet on his own power. His broken leg had been healed. As he turned to make his way up to the tree, though, all could see that his arms were no longer wrapped in bloody bandages, yet they still ended at his wrists. It looked as though the mother had not been able to replace what had been taken. Redford's face was grim as he was helped towards the waterfall in much the same way. He looked at Cody and shrugged. "Well, it was fun hoping." He struggled off the carrier that the wind Tarins held. Air again wrapped around him, steadying him as he hopped on his one good leg into the water. Brady shook his head wryly. Holding him like that is much better. I don't know why I didn't think of it. Jessalyn patted the heavy kid on the arm. I'm sure it's better for their pride. Maybe not so good for their broken legs. When Redford emerged from the falls and, like Spencer, was able to walk on both legs, the crowd's cheers were subdued. Cody met him, and together they climbed up the hill to find the tree. Then it was Damien's turn. The gaunt kid sourly watched the water Tarins come back, then step out of the river. None offered to help him. Physically, he was well able to make the trip on his own. Apparently, you have to be in the right crowd to get any help around here. And apparently, I'm not in it. Chris quickly shed his bracers, weapons, boots, and hat. No, helping you is my job. But before he stepped into the river with his Tarin, he took Jessalyn close and briefly kissed her, telling her Vanna would be back for her. But she batted him away. Her eyes were fixed on nothing but the waterfall. He laughed softly. He remembered that feeling. Taking Damien by the arm, he roughly pushed him into the water. You know the drill. You've already been to see the mother. Nothing has changed since the last time. Finding the rope that would guide them against the current, they pulled themselves to the falls. When they climbed the rock shelf behind them, JT was waiting for them. One by one, they crawled through the small portal, and JT and Chris took their positions by the wall as Damien walked on. Somewhere up ahead, inside the mists that filled the cavern, he would find Frey Took, and she would do for him what no one else could. As they waited, Chris expected the spirit focus to use this time to reprimand him. He fidgeted as he waited for the native to speak. For a few moments, he wondered if JT was using his Tarin to add to his uneasiness, then remembered that their powers didn't work inside this cave. He ran through an imaginary conversation with the focus, reminding himself again and again that he and his friends had done nothing wrong. They had freed the Tarins from jail. They'd taken good horses and good hands to travel faster than anyone else could have. And they'd gotten to Cody just in the nick of time. Town's religious leaders had planned a very public execution for their prisoners, the Tarins. No doubt there would have been some stupid celebration and lots of speeches about their god's triumph over Frey Took's power. And then there were the other Tarins, the ones JT had sent. Well, they had failed miserably, precisely for the very reasons that Chris had laid out during their council meeting. They had stepped into an unbreakable ambush and had taken grievous losses. Without Chris's bunch of rogues, they would still be caught in that tunnel. He checked JT, but the other man was using a small whetstone to sharpen his bowie knife. Periodically, the natives stopped to study the mists that hid the cave's true dimensions, and Chris settled back to wait. In the still small space of his mind, he knew that he had not really been needed on that trip. Brandon, Rolan, Ada, Chiari, and Andreas, any one of them could have led their group with the same speed. And when it came to getting their 4 Tarins out of the Cody jail, Chiari and Andreas, as well as Jade, had been the real rock stars. His enormous firepower had not been necessary. And the battle above the tunnels, Floyd, Andreas, and Chiari had been the ones to win that. His firepower had helped, and it had been flashy, but any other fire Tarin could have accomplished the same effect. He straightened, hooked his thumbs into the belt of his chinks, and leaned up against the wall of the cave. The mists slowly swirled and twisted before him, beautiful in their own way, and the ancient tiled walk leading to Frey Took's avatar disappeared below them. Not even the light from her presence fully filtered through them, leaving JT and Chris to wait in semi-darkness. Apprehension filled him. He was not looking forward to the coming confrontation. Anyone could have done what he did, and that was true. Only nobody had. He'd seen an open gate in the fence and stood in the gap. Then he remembered how carefully the Yellowstone focuses had looked for him, how they'd sent a large crew with no other reason but to protect him. Because he could not die. He was the fire focus, and every fire Tarin in Yellowstone needed him. To do this. To bring the ones who'd burnt themselves out before the mother. The new ones? the ones who survived that terrible fever and managed to cope with their new powers, they had to come before her to gain control of their talent. Hell, at this point, they didn't even know how Tarins were made. What happened if one died? Did Frey Matuk just produce another one? What if the Tarins were born? Would they have to wait 20 years for the new one to become strong enough to carry the gift? This whole thing was so new, and nobody really had any idea or any kind of plan in place. No ancient methods had been handed down, no books describing alternative ways to handle these things. Rubbing at the scars across his forehead, he grimaced. There was that extra line there, marking him as the focus. The mother had chosen him right from the start. When Brent had tried to challenge him to take his place, she'd rejected that possibility. Chris looked at JT, but the black-haired man was now squatting on his heels as he leaned against the cave's wall, his eyes black and quiescent. Then he rose and walked forward, and Damien emerged from the mists. The disturbing aura was no longer there, replaced by a huge smile on the gaunt kid's face. Wordlessly, keeping the solemn dignity of this sacred place, Chris thumped a congratulatory hand on the skinny kid's shoulder. Still grinning like a maniac, Damien rushed for the portal and quickly slid through it. When Chris crawled out onto the ledge behind the falling water, Damien said, "Come on, Focus. We got to get to the tree so I can have my fire back." Chris laughed at the kid's exuberance and jumped into the water not far behind. As they emerged onto the trail to the tree, Damien fairly ran, giving Chris no chance to check on Jessalyn. But he waved at her as he turned up the path, then only just caught up when Damien reached the tree. Together, they knelt to wrap their hands around the slender sapling's base, and Damien froze as the mother's communion gripped him. Slowly, respectfully, Chris took his hands away and rose to his feet. This moment was for Damien, not for Chris to make up for lost time. He had only been here once. That night he had received his own healing from the mother. He hadn't come back. He trained horses, gone hunting and fishing, tended to problems amongst his fire Tarins, welded little repair jobs, and helped where he could. Yet he left this undone. This part of being a Tarin. As he stood back, an image came to his mind. His trip to save Jessalyn, Spencer, Redford, and Ariel had been like him running across the corrals to plug an open hole, but he left the head catch open to do it. He dropped his head and swept his wet hair back, trying to hide the flush of embarrassment he felt rising to his cheeks. The most rookie of all rookie mistakes. Another image entered his mind, a memory this time. His father put a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You got lucky, boy. Nothing got out." Then his voice rose, and his weather-worn blue eyes flashed with anger. Extending his hand, all fingers pointed forward, he shoved it in Chris's face with each word. "But it could have been a lot worse." He stood pensively. Yeah, the mother had gotten her point across. Right to the heart. Thank goodness, just then Damien rose from his knees, his face split by a huge grin. The skinny kid let out a primal cry that reverberated through the gathering darkness. Then the crowd cheered as he let the fire fly from his hands. When Damien built his flames to rise higher and higher until they almost reached the top of the trees, the crowd voiced their approval again. Recalling his flames, he built a small ball, slinging it all around himself. Then he whipped it along straight lines so that it looked like he was playing with a blazing yo-yo. Other fire Tarins cried out their approval and immediately tried to imitate his trick. Ariel was amongst the watchers, and Jade stood by her side. Together, with several other spirit Tarins, they raised their beers to the kid, celebrating the way he showed his strength. That bunch always kept themselves a bit apart during celebrations like this. The Billings brewers had come from their regular place down by the campground and circulated amongst the crowd. They led several ponies with them, each carrying a couple of kegs of beer, and they passed out glass jars from a drinking pack. While Damien demonstrated a few skills he learned while traveling, Rolan secured a glass to Spencer's forearm. Shelby protested, saying she would hold his beer, but Rolan only laughed and told her a man wants to be in control of his own drinking. Redford and Cody, the two friends from Billings, were surrounded by others. Redford's partial healing was celebrated as much as the other Tarins' demonstrations of power. Chiari stood with them and clinked her glass jar to Cody's. Then they both took a hearty drink. Brady seemed to be sticking close to her side. Over the course of their homeward ride, the small but powerful rock Tarin had warmed to the hefty air Tarin. Chris watched Terrace Iron, the rock focus, take his buffalo bull lower. With a pat against the enormous shoulder, he sent his companions to get away from the crazy humans. Wind Rising, still in her winged suit, was beside him, holding not just her own beer jar, but also his. Chris looked around for Rusty and saw the big dog come loping up the steep incline. Ada and Jesselyn followed him, as well as Vanna, the water focus, and JT. As Rusty bumped against his hip, Chris let a hand trail over his thick-coated shoulder. Killer trailed along, but would not come close enough to receive his pat. Then, as Rusty ran on to greet Rolan, Killer followed along, but carefully stayed away from the celebrating people. There were many other dogs around, and Chris hoped the brindle pit bull would not get in a fight tonight. As Jesselyn reached the tree, she didn't spare a single glance for Chris. Her eyes shone intensely blue as she knelt at the sapling's base and wrapped both hands around it. While the crowd didn't pause their celebration, they moved back to give their newest water Terran room as she communed with Frey Matuk. Ada grinned at him. "Finally, we are all where we are supposed to be." She slung her arms around him briefly, then ran off to stand with Rolan. By the looks of it, her beau was telling another tall tale of their recent adventures. JT and Vanna joined him as they waited for Jesselyn. The dark-haired girl knelt, her head thrown back, and her eyes shone blue as she lifted them to the sky. Long moments passed before she took her hands off the tree and gave a deep-throated cry. All around, the crowd responded, exclaiming their support. With the scars around her face raised and pulsing, Jesselyn lifted her hands. She formed a sheet of water that rose to a cone, then splashed down all around her. Laughing exuberantly, she turned to Chris and doused him from head to toe. The crowd cheered as wildly for her more modest results as they had for the impressive strength Damien had demonstrated. Tonight, power didn't matter. Only that the Tarins had been confirmed and could now add to the success of the Yellowstone Circle. JT, Wind, Travis, and Vanna gently began herding the crowd away from the tree, directing them to the asphalt parking lot just above the canyon. Unbidden, Chris helped them, and people drifted away from this sacred place. When a cold, hard rain began to fall, people stopped dawdling. Horses and bikes were retrieved and mounted, and the call came forward that the celebration would continue at the horse lines. Chris sidled Sour Patch closer to Jesselyn as they loped through the dark night, following the park road. "There are tarps and tents for the saddles there. After we get the horses put up, we can shelter under those." Just looking at her, here with him in this beautiful place, made his heart sing. With her black hair soaked by the rain, she smiled at him, trusting him. Rolan and Vanna loped ahead of them as Rusty and Killer ran alongside, their tongues lolling happily. Even the tired mules sensed the end of their journey and ran with renewed energy. He caught a glimpse of Travis and Wind amongst the crowd and remembered that he would have to face the council tomorrow. But tonight, this cold, rainy night, it was for homecoming, for celebration, and for building the ties that would bind through thick and thin. This was a story from the Wyoming Terran Rising series, and we want to thank you sincerely for listening. Please press that like button now, since that'll help the vid and story get recommended for others. Besides, nothing makes a person's day more than seeing those likes. This part was called Wyoming Terrans Rising, Return and Relief. It was written by Ashakery Dart. Josh C. Williams of Atlantia is the editor and narrator. It is copyrighted for July 13th, 2026. Hopefully, we'll have another one ready for you soon, so be sure to subscribe and check for updates.